When I woke up for the second time in my life, I understood that destiny was not a verdict, but a rough draft waiting for revision. My name is Iris Moore, and in my first life I died buried under accusations I never committed, erased by a girl who smiled while stealing everything I had earned. I grew up in a place where effort was the only currency that never devalued. My grandmother raised me after my parents passed, and every late night of study was a promise that her sacrifices would not be wasted. Clara Wynne entered my life like sunlight through a clean window. She was rich, elegant, endlessly generous in public. Teachers praised her warmth, classmates trusted her kindness, and I believed she was my friend. Only after dying once did I learn her secret. When emotions surged, she could hear fragments of other people's thoughts. She harvested answers, essays, strategies, and turned borrowed brilliance into her own reputation. In my first life, she mirrored my work perfectly, then accused me of copying her. The world chose the version that felt more comfortable. I died disgraced, and my grandmother followed soon after from grief. This time, I returned months before the national examination, with memory intact and mercy gone. If Clara wanted my thoughts, I would feed her lies. I trained myself to think wrong answers while writing the correct ones. I rehearsed false confidence, imagined flawed logic, and hid my real calculations on paper and instinct. As expected, Clara's scores began to fall whenever I sabotaged my own thoughts. She smiled through it, unaware that she was drowning in my deliberate mistakes. I entered competitions I had once avoided and documented my work publicly, leaving trails she could not rewrite. When the national exams arrived, my hand moved faster than doubt, while my mind whispered chaos. I ranked first in the province. Clara barely passed. She accused me anyway. This time, cameras, drafts, timestamps, and witnesses answered for me. University brought new arenas, and Clara followed again, clinging to my shadow. I allowed it. I designed innovations meant to collapse when stolen blindly. She copied them without understanding. Her patrons fell. Her power vanished. When she attacked me in desperation, the police ended her story. Years later, my work powered cities and saved lives. When people asked how I succeeded, I told them the truth. Never let anyone live inside your mind. That line became my private oath. But oaths are useless without technique. In the months after my return, I treated my own mind like an apartment with thin walls. If Clara could hear through emotion, then my first offense had to be emotional control, not numbness, but regulation. I practiced breathing until my pulse stopped spiking during surprise questions. I learned to keep my face neutral when teachers praised me, and to keep my voice steady when classmates whispered. At night, when my hands shook, I wrote the fear down so it wouldn't spill into my thoughts the next day. I built rituals. A cold glass of water before study, a timed walk after, and a rule that any strong feeling had to pass through paper first. I also tested the limits of her gift. Clara's secret had taken me an entire lifetime to understand, but now I had a second chance and a scientist's patience. I watched for her tells, the slight tilt of her chin when she tried to listen, the way her smile sharpened when she found something useful, the sudden generosity that followed when she sensed my confidence. I provoked small emotional spikes on purpose, dropping a pencil, letting a teacher call on me unexpectedly, and tracked whether Clara's eyes flickered as if catching radio static. The pattern held. She caught fragments when I felt heat, embarrassment, anger, pride. When I stayed cool, she was blind. So I trained myself to run 2 tracks at once. The first track lived on paper, the correct solution, written cleanly, step by step. The second track lived in my head, deliberate noise. I memorized wrong methods well enough to think them convincingly. I rehearsed common traps until I could panic internally with believable mistakes, while my hand calmly executed the right answer. At first it felt like lying to myself. Then it felt like building a decoy room in a house that had already been burglarized. Clara didn't suspect because she couldn't imagine someone refusing to be readable. She assumed other people's minds were public property, like gossip. When I started thinking in wrong answers, she copied them with confidence. Her grades dipped in subtle ways. One careless sign error here, one missing assumption there. She blamed fatigue. She blamed teachers. She blamed me in private, but she couldn't accuse me openly yet because her image relied on sweetness. She needed me close, not hostile. I used that need. I invited her to study sessions and made a show of being grateful for her help. In front of others, I let her correct my decoy reasoning, so she would believe I was truly struggling. Meanwhile, I built a small circle of classmates who cared more about learning than ranking. We traded handwritten drafts, dated and initialed, like a quiet contract. We used a cheap scanning app at the library that stamped time and location on every page. I learned to love boring evidence. Evidence is anti-glamour, and that is why it works. The first major trap was the Provincial Math Olympiad. In my first life, I had avoided it because Clara hovered near every competition like a spotlight. This time I registered early and posted my practice progress publicly on the school's forum. Nothing confidential, just enough to show steady improvement and consistent authorship. Clara congratulated me loudly, then cornered me afterward and asked what topics I feared. I answered with decoy fear. Geometry proofs, I said, while thinking a deliberately flawed proof pattern I knew would collapse under stress. Her eyes brightened. She thought she had found my weakness. On the day of the Olympiad, I walked into the room with a calm I had earned through repetition. When the first problem appeared, I let my heart lift just a little and immediately forced my thoughts into the decoy channel. Wrong theorem, wrong angle chase, wrong assumption. Clara, seated 2 rows behind, shifted in her chair as if tasting the signal. I wrote the correct proof anyway, hands steady, and moved on. I finished early. Clara stayed late. When results came back, I placed top 3. Clara placed in the middle. She laughed it off in public. In private, she stared at me like I was a broken mirror. Her next move was to bait me emotionally. She started small. "Did your grandmother raise you because your parents couldn't?" she asked one afternoon with a soft voice that carried a blade. In my first life, grief would have surged and my thoughts would have spilled open. This time I had practiced. I let the pain pass through my ribs and out of my breath without turning into heat. I answered, "My grandmother raised me because she loved me." And then I thought, very deliberately, of a fake scholarship application I had written as decoy, one full of embarrassing errors. Clara smiled, satisfied with the humiliation she believed she had harvested. She didn't realize I had not given her the real thing. The national exam season turned the school into a pressure cooker. Teachers whispered predictions. Parents offered gifts to tutors. Clara thrived in the chaos, because chaos makes people readable. I refused to be readable. I built a schedule that left no room for last-minute panic. I slept on time. I ate on time. I practiced under timed conditions until the clock stopped feeling like an enemy. When anxiety rose, I named it silently and let it sit like a stone instead of a storm. Clara watched me and misread it as arrogance. The night before the exam, Clara messaged me a long paragraph about friendship, forgiveness, and how we should stop competing. In my first life, that message had softened me, and softness had been my opening. This time I recognized it as a fishing line. I replied politely, then shut my phone off and placed it face down. I opened my notebook and wrote 1 page of decoy worry, imagining failure, imagining embarrassment, then closed it and breathed until my mind went quiet again. I slept. During the exam itself, I kept my inner monologue messy on purpose. I pictured wrong formulas. I imagined teachers shaking their heads. I even imagined the test booklet printed with misaligned pages, all to create believable cognitive noise. My hand, meanwhile, wrote the correct answers the way muscle memory writes. I had trained for this. The most difficult part wasn't the questions. It was performing confusion without becoming confused. When scores were announced, the numbers landed like a clean bell. First in the province, a scholarship that would cover everything, a future that couldn't be bargained away. Clara's score was not a disaster, but it was not hers because it had never been hers. She accused me anyway, louder than before, because desperation makes people reckless. She told administrators I had stolen her work. She produced evidence copies of drafts that matched mine. In my first life, that had been enough because her reputation filled the gaps. This time, the gaps were full of timestamps. I brought a binder to the disciplinary meeting. Inside were the forum posts, the dated study group drafts, the library scans, the teacher feedback emails, and a video clip from a classroom camera showing me handing my own draft to a teacher weeks earlier. I said nothing dramatic. I let the paper speak. Clara's face tightened as each piece landed. She tried to cry. The counselor looked uncomfortable. Then the vice principal asked a simple question. Why did Clara's original drafts contain my handwriting pressure marks from the left margin, visible under light? Clara didn't know paper could betray her. The room changed temperature. The school cleared my name officially. Clara received a warning and a forced counseling referral. It wasn't justice. Not yet. She still had money, influence, and a family that knew how to make problems disappear. I knew better than to believe a single victory meant safety. I took the scholarship and left for university with my files duplicated and stored in 3 places. University gave Clara new hunting grounds, and me new room to maneuver. She followed, as I had predicted she would, because she couldn't tolerate a life where I existed outside her reach. She chose the same major and joined the same research circles, introducing herself with humility that was rehearsed. Professors liked her. Donors liked her. She offered to help younger students, cultivating loyalty like a garden. If I had been only angry, she would have beaten me again. So I stayed boring and methodical. In our 2nd year, I joined a lab that worked on sensor networks for public infrastructure systems that could detect stress fractures in bridges, leaks in pipelines, contamination in water lines. The work mattered. It was also perfect for my purpose, because engineering leaves a trail. Every commit has a timestamp. Every dataset has provenance. Clara tried to attach herself to the project, offering connections and social polish. I let her. I assigned her tasks that looked important but required understanding to execute correctly. Then I built decoy designs elegant on the surface, fatally flawed in the core. Clara copied the decoy designs into a pitch deck for a patron who liked young geniuses. She presented them with confidence borrowed from my calm. The design failed during a demonstration, not catastrophically, but enough to reveal she didn't understand her own slides. The patron's smile cooled. The lab director asked Clara to explain the assumptions behind her model. Clara's thoughts couldn't help her because she was emotional panicked, and the only mind she could hear was her own. She stammered. The room saw it. A reputation can survive one mistake. It cannot survive exposure of emptiness. Clara retaliated by trying to frame me as the saboteur. She told people I had set her up. In a way, she was right, but I had done it with consent and documentation. My lab notes showed which files were shared and when, and my messages to her were clear about which versions were experimental and which were verified. She had chosen theft. Theft comes with risk. The lab director didn't punish her publicly, but he removed her from sensitive work. She lost access. She smiled through it, but her smile cracked at the corners. The more she lost, the more she leaned on the only weapon she had left, public perception. She started an anonymous account that posted vague warnings about toxic competition and students who pretend to be victims. People love a moral mystery. They shared it. I watched the posts and recognized her rhythm the way she wrote, like she was speaking into a mirror. I did not respond online. Instead, I filed a report with the university's digital safety office and handed them a packet of IP correlations and login pattern analysis that a friend in computer science helped me compile. Again, boring evidence. The investigation took months, and Clara assumed she was safe because the process was slow. Then, one afternoon, campus security asked her to come in for an interview. She arrived in class afterward with eyes too bright, a sign of contained fury. She sat behind me and tried to provoke an emotional spike by whispering my grandmother's name like it was a curse. My chest tightened. I thought of my grandmother's hands, rough from work, gentle when turning pages. I let the love stay cool. Cool love is still love. Clara heard nothing useful. The security office couldn't prove everything, but they proved enough. The anonymous account, the harassment of students, the forged emails sent to professors. Clara was placed on probation and barred from certain networks. Her family tried to negotiate. The university refused. She had crossed too many documented lines. That should have been the end. But people like Clara don't stop because they are corrected. They stop when they are contained. And containment requires more than rules. It requires consequences that touch what they value. Clara valued power and the ability to rewrite narratives. So I built my final trap in the domain she trusted most: dependency. In our final year, my team's sensor network prototype drew interest from a municipal grant program. It was the kind of funding that could turn a student project into a startup. Clara, desperate to regain status, inserted herself into the application process through an alumni liaison. She offered to polish the proposal. I agreed publicly, so she would feel invited. Privately, I created a decoy appendix, an alternate set of performance claims that looked plausible to a thief but would fail regulatory review. I seeded it where Clara could find it. Wrapped in the kind of confident language she loved, she stole it. She submitted it through her contacts as if it were her work, hoping to claim credit before our team could. But grant applications create paper trails. The program's reviewers flagged the inconsistent numbers and contacted our lab for clarification. When we presented the real appendix, the reviewers asked why another version had been submitted under a different name. Clara's name. The room went quiet in the way rooms do when a lie becomes administratively inconvenient. The program escalated to fraud investigation because public money was involved. Clara panicked and tried to destroy digital records, but deletion is also a record. The university's IT logs showed her access attempts, her file transfers, her late-night logins. When police interviewed her, she tried to cry and call it misunderstanding. The detective asked why the files were on her laptop in a folder labeled Mine. Clara had no answer that could survive a timestamp. The day she was escorted out of the administration building, she looked at me with a hatred that was almost awe. "How did you do it?" she hissed. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a speech. I said only, "You listened to the wrong voice." I meant it literally. She had spent her life listening for other people's thoughts and never learned to build her own. After that, my life moved forward in a way that felt unreal because it was no longer scripted by fear. I graduated. I built a career in infrastructure monitoring, first as an engineer, then as a project lead. My designs helped detect gas leaks before explosions, stress fractures before collapses, contamination before outbreaks. The work was quiet, unromantic, essential. It also healed something in me. I had spent my first life being erased by accusation. Now I built systems that made hidden danger visible. I visited my grandmother's grave when I got my first major patent. I placed the certificate in a clear sleeve and held it above the grass so the ink wouldn't touch damp soil. I told her what I had done, not with bitterness, but with gratitude for the discipline she had taught me. I realized that my second life wasn't about revenge. It was about refusing to be easy to steal from refusing in exams, in labs, in love, in identity. Years later, when a journalist asked me in an interview whether I believed privacy was obsolete, I smiled for the first time in a way that felt light. I said privacy is not secrecy. Privacy is ownership of your inner life. Without it, consent becomes meaningless, and meaning becomes something anyone can take. People quoted that line like it was inspirational. I knew it was practical. The story of Clara's downfall traveled faster than the legal paperwork. People asked for details, hungry for a villain and a victim. I refused to be either in their mouths. I answered questions with the same rule I had used in courtrooms and committee rooms. I speak in facts, not theater. That decision cost me some social currency. It also protected my sanity. The internet wanted a headline. I preferred a boundary. Still, consequences have echoes. Clara's family hired a private investigator to find dirt on me, as if morality were a game of symmetrical bruises. The investigator followed me for a month, then stopped. Later I learned why. There was no secret scandal, only routines, code commits, and a small apartment with too many notebooks. People who rely on drama become bored by discipline. Boredom is an underrated defense. My first startup role came with its own predators, investors who smiled while pressing for control, executives who wanted ownership of patents they hadn't earned, partners who treated my name as a marketing lever. Clara had trained me, unintentionally, to recognize theft even when it wore a suit. I built contracts like I built circuits, with redundancy, with fail-safes, with triggers that documented every change. When someone asked for access without reason, I asked for the reason in writing. When someone asked me to trust them, I asked what safeguards would exist if trust broke. The people who meant well answered. The people who meant harm got annoyed. Annoyance is a confession. In my third year post-graduation, the city offered my company a contract to install sensors along an aging waterfront. The project was politically visible and financially tempting. It was also a risk, because the Port Authority had a history of burying problems. I insisted on independent data custody. Our sensors would write to a public archive, mirrored in 2 universities, so no single agency could edit a failure out of existence. The port director called me paranoid. I called it engineering ethics. We signed anyway because the mayor wanted good press and didn't understand the long-term implications. That suited me. The archive protected everyone, including the people who didn't know they needed protection. The first scandal we uncovered wasn't structural. It was human. A contractor had been falsifying inspection reports to keep timelines on track. In the old world, someone like Clara would have turned that into a narrative war. In the world I was building, it became a documentation problem. We released the sensor anomalies, the matched timestamps, and the inspection gaps. The contractor was removed. The project paused. The mayor complained. Then a storm hit, and the section we had flagged would have failed. The archive made the near disaster undeniable. Public trust isn't built by being liked, it's built by being accurate. After the storm, a graduate student emailed me about an idea. Could emotional states leak information the way radio signals leak through thin walls? The student was writing a thesis on cognitive privacy. I laughed softly at the irony my life had become a case study. I invited her to my office, and we talked for hours about consent, neurodivergence, surveillance capitalism, and the difference between empathy and extraction. We decided to fund a research fellowship, not to chase Clara's kind of mind-reading as spectacle, but to build tools that protected people from invasive inference, algorithms that reduced data leakage, interfaces that made consent explicit, frameworks that taught schools and employers how not to weaponize psychology. The fellowship attracted critics. A columnist wrote that I was obsessed with privacy and should move on from my trauma. Move on is what abusers tell survivors when they don't want to be inconvenienced by prevention. I didn't answer the columnist. I published the fellowship's first report instead. Practical guidelines for ethical data collection, classroom integrity protocols, and a clear warning about how reputations can be engineered through stolen work. The report was cited by universities. Quiet impact is still impact. I dated, eventually, but cautiously. The first person I trusted was a civil engineer named Rowan who had a habit of asking before touching my arm, as if consent were normal rather than romantic. When I told him, in fragments, about the first life and the second, he didn't demand proof, and he didn't treat it as entertainment. He asked what safety looked like for me. I said, consistency, no surprise punishments, no tests. Rowan nodded and said, then we won't test each other. It was the simplest agreement I had ever made, and it felt like a miracle because it required no strategy. Love didn't fix me. It didn't need to. It simply became another place where I practiced authorship. I learned to say when something made me uncomfortable, without apologizing for the discomfort. I learned to accept kindness without searching for the hidden invoice. Some days my body still braced when people praised me, because praise had once been bait. Rowan would notice and ask, gently, "Are you here?" And I would breathe and answer, "Yes." Clara's legal case concluded in a way that the public found anticlimactic: probation, restitution, and a ban from certain professional licenses. The court recognized fraud but couldn't punish thoughts. That was fine. The point was not to destroy her soul. The point was to stop her from destroying other people's lives. Still, when the final paperwork arrived, my hands shook. I wasn't afraid of Clara anymore. I was afraid of how much of my life had been built around her gravity. When a planet leaves orbit, the body has to learn new balance. That year, I also learned something uncomfortable about myself. I had become addicted to readiness. I had trained for betrayal so long that peace felt like an ambush. Therapy helped. My therapist called it hypervigilance and treated it like a skill that had outlived its purpose. She taught me to recognize safety signals the way I had once recognized danger signals. It sounds simple. It is not. Safety is subtle. Danger is loud. But subtle things can be learned with practice. Part of my recovery was allowing myself to feel anger without turning it into a plan. In my second life, I had weaponized calm as armor, and the armor had saved me. But armor is heavy. Eventually, you have to set it down. I started writing essays private at first about the difference between intelligence and theft, about how institutions prefer comfortable stories to accurate ones, about how the brilliant poor are often treated as suspicious, while the mediocre rich are treated as inevitable. Writing those truths without attaching them to a courtroom outcome felt like exhaling. The essays became a book proposal after a publisher reached out. I hesitated. Publication is exposure, and exposure is risk. But I had also learned that secrecy protects predators, so I negotiated the contract with obsessive care. I owned the narrative. I retained legal review. I protected names that didn't need to be public. And I required that a portion of profits fund scholarships for students accused unfairly of plagiarism. The publisher agreed because the story was marketable. I accepted because the infrastructure mattered. When the book released, reviewers fixated on the mind reader angle, trying to turn my life into a paranormal thriller. I corrected the framing in interviews. Clara didn't have magic. She had exploitation. Whether her ability was supernatural or psychological didn't change the ethics. Consent was the line. Everyone wants a sensational villain because it lets them ignore the ordinary ways people steal. I refused that escape. I kept talking about systems, favoritism, charisma, bias, class protection, and the lazy lie that Good people don't do bad things. A year later, a high school invited me to speak about academic integrity. I expected bored faces. Instead, I saw anxious ones. After the talk, a quiet student approached and confessed she had been accused of cheating because her answers were too perfect. She showed me her notebooks messy, honest, dated. It was the same story in a smaller body. I helped her organize her evidence and connected her with a legal aid partner from our fellowship. The accusation was dropped. The student cried in the hallway, not from joy but from exhaustion. I remembered my first life and felt, for once, an emotion that arrived without permission. Relief for someone else. Relief is a kind of justice. In the last phase of my story, the antagonist is not Clara. It is the temptation to let cynicism become my personality. Cynicism is easy after betrayal. It feels like wisdom. But it is also another way of letting a thief live inside your mind rent-free, permanent. I chose a different practice. Skepticism with openness. Verify. But don't assume harm where there is none. Document. But don't turn every relationship into a case file. Protect your boundaries, but don't build a cage and call it safety. One evening, years after everything, Rowan and I walked past the university library, where I had scanned my drafts for evidence. The windows were lit. Students bent over tables, hungry for futures. I paused and watched them, and I realized my second life had changed not because I became stronger in some mythic sense, but because I learned how to build structures that could hold me when people tried to push. That lesson is transferable. It is the only kind of magic I trust. Before I could build companies and fellowships, I had to survive the small wars of campus life. Clara's probation didn't make her powerless. It made her subtle. She stopped competing in obvious arenas and moved to social engineering. She befriended people around me, offering them favors and gifts, then nudging them to share what they knew. She tried to turn my network into her listening devices. I countered by changing my habits. No sensitive work discussed in cafeterias. No passwords reused. No plans shared with anyone who hadn't earned trust over time. It wasn't paranoia. It was operational hygiene. The first time I caught her running that tactic, it was almost laughable. A classmate named Devin approached me with forced casualness and asked what grant program I was applying to. His tone was too rehearsed. He kept glancing at the door. Clara waited outside. I answered with a harmless lie, an art fellowship I had no interest in, then watched Devin's shoulders relax, as if he had completed a task. The next day, Clara mentioned, in conversation, how creative grants were underrated. Her smile was proud, like a thief admiring their own reflection. I let her have that moment, because the lie cost me nothing and taught me exactly which wires she was pulling. I started labeling my own information by tier. Tier 1, public facts that could be shared safely. Tier 2, technical details that required context and could be shared only with collaborators. Tier 3, strategy, legal matters, and anything connected to funding or intellectual property. Tier 3 never left my encrypted drive. When people asked for details, I learned to say, "I'm not ready to share that," without adding excuses. Excuses invite negotiation. Boundaries do not. The lab director, Professor Han, became an unexpected ally. He was not warm, but he was fair, and fairness is rarer than warmth in competitive places. After Clara's failed demonstration, he pulled me aside and asked, "Did you anticipate this?" I answered honestly, "Yes." He studied me for a long moment, then said, "Do not become like her." The warning landed deep. It forced me to audit myself. My traps were defensive, but defense can slide into cruelty if you start enjoying it. I promised myself I would never design harm for entertainment. Every snare I built had one rule. It would only close if the thief reached in first. Professor Han later helped me formalize our lab's authorship protocol. We created internal notebooks that were signed weekly, like old-school research ledgers. We required that major claims be reproducible by at least 2 people. We taught students to treat documentation not as bureaucracy, but as respect for truth. Clara hated those changes because they made her talent useless. She couldn't steal what couldn't be separated from process. Process is the enemy of parasitism. Still, she tried. She attempted to trigger my emotions in meetings by bringing up my grandmother again, by implying my scholarship was charity, by hinting that people like me should be grateful and quiet. Each time, I watched her like an engineer watching a failing system. She repeated the same inputs, expecting the same outputs. When I didn't react, she escalated. She tried to flirt with Rowan in front of me. aiming for jealousy. Rowan looked confused, then politely excused himself. Later, he asked, "Was that supposed to bother you?" I said, "It was supposed to control me." Rowan shook his head and said, "That's pathetic." Hearing someone name it plainly helped. Manipulation loses power when it is described accurately. The municipal grant trap became the turning point because it shifted our conflict from campus politics to public accountability. Investigators don't care about popularity. They care about records. During the inquiry, I sat across from a compliance officer who asked why I had anticipated theft. I told him, "Because theft is a pattern, and patterns repeat until they are interrupted." The officer asked how I had protected my work. I described the protocol, the commit history, the witness structure. When I finished, he said, almost reluctantly, "You've done our job for us." I didn't take it as a compliment. I took it as proof that institutions often outsource safety to individuals until individuals force them to do better. Clara's arrest did not feel triumphant. It felt like watching a storm finally hit land after weeks of humidity. The air cleared, but the damage remained. Some students whispered that I had ruined Clara's life. They said it the way people say a building fell without naming gravity. I wanted to scream that Clara had ruined mine first. Instead, I asked myself whether their opinion mattered. It didn't. It was a cheap story they told to avoid the uncomfortable reality that a charming person can be dangerous. The weeks after the arrest were messy. Clara's allies tried to salvage her narrative by framing her as mentally ill, as if illness absolves deliberate harm. I refused to participate in that framing. If Clara was ill, she still chose theft. If she was not ill, she still chose theft. Diagnosis does not rewrite consent. I told investigators only what I knew, what she took, how she took it, and where the proof lived. The rest was not mine to label. When the court finally issued its ruling, reporters waited outside the building. Cameras flashed. Microphones rose like spears. They wanted tears. They wanted confession. They wanted a perfect moral. I walked past them without stopping. In the car, Rowan squeezed my hand and asked if I was okay. I answered with a truth that surprised me. "I'm tired. Not angry, not victorious, just tired." He nodded, as if tiredness were sacred. That tiredness pushed me to build something beyond my own survival. I remembered the smaller students I had met, the ones accused because they didn't fit the expected shape of talent. I remembered how easily teachers believed Clara in my first life, because her wealth made her story feel safe. I didn't want to spend my second life merely dodging knives. I wanted to dull them for others. So I partnered with 2 universities and a nonprofit to create an integrity archive for student work. A voluntary system where drafts could be time-stamped, hashed, and stored privately, accessible only when disputes arose. It wasn't about policing. It was about protection. Some administrators hated it because it admitted disputes existed. Some students loved it because it gave them a shield. Clara would have hated it because it made theft inefficient. The archive expanded into a broader project, cognitive privacy education. We taught students how to recognize manipulation tactics, flattery as bait, guilt as leverage, urgency as trap. We taught them how to say no without explanation. We taught them how to document without becoming obsessive. We taught them that being kind does not mean being accessible. Watching teenagers learn those skills felt like watching my own younger self receive tools I hadn't had. It didn't erase the first life. It redeemed it in small ways. My grandmother remained the quiet center of everything I built. I kept her old recipe cards in a wooden box on my desk, not because I cooked often, but because the handwriting reminded me of endurance. When projects went wrong, when budgets tightened, when politics tried to bend data, I would open the box and read a line like, "Add salt slowly," and remember that patience is an engineering principle too. She had lived through loss without turning bitter. That was my model. One year, the scholarship committee asked me to deliver an annual lecture. I chose a topic that sounded dull: attribution and error. In the lecture, I explained that real work includes mistakes, revisions, dead ends, and ugly drafts. Thieves prefer polished outcomes because process exposes them. I told the audience to keep their ugly drafts, to be proud of them, because ugly drafts are proof of learning. Afterward, a professor told me he had never thought of drafts as protection. I told him protection is often hidden in things people dismiss as unimportant. On a quiet night, long after the headlines, I received an email from an unknown address. It was from Clara. Not a public post, not a performance, just a short note. She wrote that she hated me for a long time and then hated herself when hatred stopped working. She wrote that listening to people's thoughts had felt like safety, because it meant she never had to be wrong. She wrote that being wrong in public had been unbearable. She did not ask forgiveness. She did not apologize properly. She simply acknowledged, in plain language, that she had lived off stolen air. I stared at the message for an hour, then archived it. I did not reply. Closure is not always a conversation. Sometimes it is the decision not to reopen a door. The last lesson I learned was simple and unromantic. Freedom is maintenance. You don't win it once. You keep it by checking locks, by reading contracts, by choosing friends carefully, by resting when you can, by refusing the performances that turn pain into currency. If my second life had any gift, it was the chance to practice maintenance with knowledge instead of regret. There were still moments when my mind tried to slip back into old tactics. If someone complimented my work too warmly, I would search for the hidden cost. If a meeting went smoothly, I would wait for the ambush after. Healing was not linear, but each time I noticed the reflex, I treated it like a bug report rather than a character flaw. Notice, log, patch, move forward. Rowan and I eventually moved into a small house with a porch that creaked when the wind shifted. On the porch we kept a bench and a blanket, and on that bench we made a rule: no devices after dinner. At first, it felt dangerous to be unreachable. Then it felt like a return to something human. I realized that the opposite of mind invasion isn't secrecy, it's chosen attention. I chose the creak of the porch, the smell of tea, the ordinary softness of evenings where nothing needed to be proven. The Integrity Archive project grew until a state education board asked for a pilot program. Politicians tried to twist it into surveillance. I refused. Protection is not policing, I said in the hearing. If students fear the archive, it will become another weapon. If they trust it, it becomes a shield. The board argued. The pilot launched with strict privacy controls. 2 months later, a student used the archive to prove a teacher had plagiarized the student's work for a publication. The irony was brutal, but the outcome was clear. Truth doesn't care who it embarrasses. After that case, universities began adopting similar systems. Some called it Iris Protocol. I didn't like the name because it put me at the center, and centers attract arrows. But I accepted that names are handles people use to carry ideas. If my name made the idea easier to hold, I would tolerate it. On the 10th anniversary of my grandmother's passing, I hosted a small scholarship dinner in her honor. It wasn't lavish. It was a room of students with nervous smiles, donors who understood that humility matters, and mentors who believed in evidence more than aura. I told them my grandmother had taught me to work quietly and to never confuse charm with goodness. Then I watched the students talk to each other, sharing drafts, sharing doubts, sharing hope. And I felt something that wasn't rage or strategy. I felt the steadier kind of pride that comes from building a future you would have needed when you were young. Later that night, alone, I opened my old binder from the disciplinary hearing, the one that had saved my second life at the doorway of my first. The pages were yellowing. The timestamps were outdated formats now, but the principle still held. When the world is eager to believe the convenient lie, you must be willing to carry the inconvenient proof. I closed the binder and placed it back on the shelf. I didn't need it every day anymore. That was how I knew I had finally stepped out of Clara's shadow. In quiet moments, I sometimes wondered what would have happened if Clara had asked for help instead of stealing it. Then I remembered that help requires humility, and humility was the one thing her gift could not provide. The past did not change because I wished it kinder. It changed because I learned to write my work in ways that could survive doubt, and I kept writing. I learned that survival is built through preparation, patience, and evidence rather than rage. Every setback became a blueprint, every betrayal a lesson in structure. The world never became kind, but I became precise, and precision was enough to carve a future no one could steal.